Thank you. So, welcome, ladies and gentlemen. We're at the Nordic Pavilion in Glasgow, and I would like to welcome you to a side event on roads to carbon neutrality, how to get there, and do we have the tools? We have a distinguished panel here, and we will get to hear three very interesting presentations that complement each other. My name is Sven Soyland, and I work as a senior advisor with the Nordic Energy Research. I will moderate this session. Nordic Energy Research is tasked to coordinate pan-Nordic energy research, prepare analysis, scenarios, and policy support for the Nordic countries. This session will present three different tools to analyze the future global energy, as well as Nordic energy system. Our most global publication, Nordic Clean Energy Scenario, will be presented by my colleague Kevin Johnson. But first, let's get a global outlook. And it gives me great pleasure to introduce Albert Chung from IEA. Albert Chung from Bloomberg New Energy Finance. Albert's group is responsible for BNF's research in renewable energy, energy storage, energy smart systems, and technologies and advanced transport, as well as cross-sector modeling. So Albert, the floor is yours.
Thank you very much. Hopefully everybody can hear me. It's my great pleasure to be here speaking to you today about our 2021 New Energy Outlook, and in particular our net zero scenarios, which was a big focus of our work this year. The New Energy Outlook is our annual report which publishes energy and emission scenarios globally out to 2050, and this year net zero was really the focus of the work. So I'm going to talk a bit about what we did, how we did it, and some of our findings this year. So the first thing we have to think about is carbon budgets, and how do we define the carbon budgets for getting to net zero. There are lots of different pathways to get to net zero by 2050. And actually, those different pathways result in very different warming outcomes. So if you have a very steep reduction in the beginning, you can maybe aim for 1.5 degrees. If you have a more gradual reduction, you're closer to 1.7, 1.8. Or you can go a bit more slowly and accelerate at the end and reach 2 degrees. But all of those are actually net zero by 2050 scenarios. So we have to think about what does net zero by 2050 really mean in terms of the carbon budget. We also run something called the economic transition scenario, which is our view of a world where policy support is removed from clean energy and just the technology and the economics takes over, and in that world, emissions actually plateau, and we think that is consistent with roughly 3 degrees of global warming. And immediately you can see the urgency in terms of that path versus the path that we need, the paths that we could need to get onto to get to net zero. We created this chart just to show you that urgency and a bit more, make it a bit more real. On the economic transition scenario, the emissions accumulate so quickly that as soon as 2027, 2028, we breach the carbon budget for 1.5 degrees. As soon as 2035, we breach the carbon budget for 1.75. And as soon as 2045, we breach the carbon budget for 2 degrees. So that's just to give you some idea of how urgent it is to bend that curve down towards those net zero curves. So what we ended up doing for this year's report is to focus on a trajectory that is Paris aligned, so gets to net zero by 2050 and stays well below 2 degrees, and in this case, 1.75 degrees trajectory. And we did that actually by taking a view of the different sectors of the economy that need to decarbonize and bucketing them into fast, slightly less fast, and even less fast than that. So the power sector, we assumed, goes the fastest in terms of decarbonization, followed by the road transport sector, and then the hard-to-abate sectors, so buildings, heavy industry, shipping, aviation, etc. And this is the curve that you get to. We then had to think about, I'm going to skip this, actually. Those are some of the principles we followed behind the emissions budgets. We then had to think about how do you actually meet that carbon budget? And we devised 3 different scenarios this year based on the prevailing technologies that are available today. So we didn't want to bake in any technologies that are not already commercially available or not already well understood. But equally, we didn't want to go for one scenario because we don't think there is necessarily one scenario where we have all the answers that's optimal. So we wanted to explore the range of different possibilities for how to reach this carbon budget. There are 3 scenarios. This clicker is not great. Okay, there are 3 scenarios. We call them green, gray, and red. And the 3 scenarios have some commonality between them. All 3 scenarios assume a high uptake of renewable energy and electrification. All 3 of them have some bioenergy in them, although it doesn't really scale up very much. And all 3 of them involve lots more recycling, circular economy, and demand-side efficiency measures as well in buildings, in transport, in energy. Now, where the 3 scenarios differ is in these solutions here in the middle, where the green scenario assumes massive uptake of green hydrogen produced from renewable energy. The gray scenario assumes that there is a role for fossil fuels combined with carbon capture and some carbon removals as well as blue hydrogen as part of that. And then the red scenario essentially envisions a bit of a renaissance for nuclear power in particular, and small modular reactors and next generation nuclear power, and hydrogen produced from nuclear as well. The 3 very different paradigms. I'm going to show you 3 charts like this, one for each scenario. The way to understand these charts is that the top line is BAU emissions if you don't do anything about climate. The bottom line here is the emissions trajectory to net zero, and all of the colors in between are the technologies that get you from BAU down to net zero. So in this green scenario, clean power, electrification, and green hydrogen do all of the heavy lifting. The shaded area there, the wind, solar, nuclear, and hydrogen in the shaded area there, that's all clean power. That's doing about 60% of the emissions abatement in this scenario. And then you have electrification and hydrogen doing the lion's share of the rest. Electrification in areas like road transport, building heat, hydrogen in heavy industry, shipping, etc. Hydrogen actually accounts for about a quarter of all the abatement if you include hydrogen in industry and in power. In our gray scenario, again, clean power makes up a huge amount of the solution, again about 60% of abatement overall. But now instead of using green hydrogen to produce flexible dispatchable power, we're using carbon capture. And we're also using carbon capture in industry as well. So what that means is the hydrogen goes away, much of it. You do still have some blue hydrogen, but actually fossil fuels, coal and gas in particular, remain part of the mix in this scenario. And then our third scenario, the red scenario, again, clean power plays a huge role, again about 60% of abatement, but this time nuclear is providing that firm power to back up wind and solar and complement storage. How much time have I used?
One more minute. 1
more minute, okay, so I'm going to skip quite a lot. So, 3 very different paradigms. I'm going to skip all the way to the last couple of slides. So, all 3 of these scenarios require very, very significant levels of investment. So the left-hand chart here just shows the amount of investment required in clean power infrastructure between now and 2050. And you can see that it's somewhere between $30 to $50 trillion between now and 2050. That's about $1.1 to $1.7 trillion per year of investment in clean power that's required. And just to give you a benchmark, today we're running at about $300 billion of investment in clean power. So we need to go about 4 or 5 times faster than we are today. And then on the right-hand side, that's the amount of investment needed to generate the power to create the hydrogen in these scenarios, and that's another 30 trillion. So we've got to double it again, so we're talking about 8 to 10 times now the amount of investment that we're seeing today in clean power. One more slide?
Right.
Okay. There's a couple of slides here on next 10 years. So I'm not going to spend time on this because I think we may be able to talk about it more later. Next 10 years, absolutely critical. And then I want to end with this slide, which is how our scenarios stack up against the IPCC scenarios. So our net zero scenarios follow this bottom line here, which is in line with the very low end of IPCC outcomes. And our economic transition scenario, which, as I mentioned, is our scenario where policy support for clean energy is withdrawn. even in that scenario, we're below the medium scenarios of the IPCC. So I take that as positive encouragement that the energy transition is underway, is going to go fast. And I think, for me, it means that we can start to discount some of the very high, very bleak emission scenarios that we've been talking about for a number of years. Thank you very much.
Thank you, excellent, Albert, for an excellent presentation. All the slides will be available online afterwards, so we went a bit quick here, but you can find it. And I appreciate your timing, so we can have some time afterwards to discuss. So next up is Kevin Johnson, my colleague. Kevin is working as a senior advisor at the Nordic Energy Research. He oversaw the preparation for this report. And he's going to present findings from this report. He holds a master's degree from the University of Bergen in renewable energy. Kevin, the floor is yours.
So thank you, Sven, for the introduction. As mentioned, I will present our new study, Nordic Clean Energy Scenarios, with a focus on Nordic pathways and key technologies for carbon neutrality. And just to have it said, there's a lot of other results as well, so please visit our website and find those if you're interested. But I wanted to start by first mentioning why we did this report. And at least one of the reasons that we started on this project was that the Nordic Prime Ministers in 2019 got together and decided that they wanted to kind of step up the Nordic cooperation on climate. And the way that they did that was that they signed a Nordic declaration on carbon neutrality. And working at Nordic Energy Research with the focus of the energy sector, and also having in mind the knowledge that the largest share of the emissions in the energy sector comes from energy, we wanted to find a way to provide a kind of background for these discussions and help the Nordic countries achieve these aims. We also have quite a large experience doing these kinds of, or funding these kinds of studies. Earlier we had the Nordic, let's see here, Nordic Energy Technology Perspectives reports that we did together with IEA earlier. So the first one we did already in 2013, and then we've updated that one in 2016. But as all of you who are here probably knows, things are changing quite fast in the energy sector, and the ambitions are also racking up on climate. So we felt generally that there was a need for a new Nordic analysis looking into the Nordic countries' energy systems. So as mentioned, we did this with help from a large consortium of energy researchers and consultants from the Nordic countries. I think we had over 30 persons involved. And as you can see their logos here, and the main project leader of this, in addition to us from our side, was Energiforsk as well. But coming into the kind of results from this study, what we wanted to do and what we made was 3 pathways for the Nordic countries. So we made 3 storylines, and this is they diverge quite a lot from the earlier studies we've done, because in those studies we changed the ambition level and looked at how that would affect the energy system. But in these 3 different storylines, the emission reductions are the same in all scenarios, but they are taking different societal pathways to get there. So for the first one, carbon neutral Nordic, this is the most cost-effective scenario, looking into how the Nordic countries can achieve each of their own national targets in the most cost-effective way. But then we also wanted to supplement this with what we call a Nordic powerhouse scenario, where the Nordic countries, in addition to achieving their national targets, also help in the bigger European transition by providing clean electricity and power-to-X fuels. And then thirdly, we had the climate neutral behavior scenario, where we wanted to look into how behavioral changes could also help affect the energy system and the changes. So in this scenario, we assume that the Nordic citizens would like to take larger changes in their lifestyle choices affecting energy use than what the official projections are assuming. So for instance, in this scenario, we've already reached peak flying in the Nordics, so the passenger air traffic in that scenario never goes above the level that we had before the corona pandemic, and then it declines slightly as well. And what we found from these three different pathways or scenarios was that most of the solutions could be grouped into what we call 5 solution tracks. And what you can see here is kind of the big chunk of fossil emissions or fossil fuels that we would like to abate the emissions from. We found that the first solution to this would probably be direct electrification. And we find that direct electrification is usually the most cost efficient and also the less costly solutions to choose. But we also recognize that there are some sectors where direct electrification either is really hard and we have low technology readiness levels in the technologies there, or it's very costly, or for some of them it's also not even possible to directly electrify. So we also need these 3 other technologies, namely Power-to-X, bioenergy, carbon capture and storage, and bioenergy, carbon capture and storage. And I'll focus most on carbon capture and storage and direct electrification in the rest of this presentation. But what we also looked into, as mentioned, was the behavioral change. And what we found for behavioral change is that it's very good at easing the transition by reducing the overall energy demand for the different sectors. So if you have a behavioral change that kind of adds to the energy transition, then you get a less costly and easier transition than if the behaviors of the population kind of increases the energy demand. But also we found that in all these 3 scenarios, behavioral change can't substitute these different technological solutions. So you need both the technological solutions in addition to the behavioral change to get the easy transition or the fast transition that we would like. So as mentioned, direct electrification is the most important tool that we have. If it's possible to electrify, you should probably do it. That could be, for instance, be to go from an internal combustion engine to an electric vehicle, or it could be to exchange an industry process where you produce heat through natural gas to a procedure where you use electric, either inductive heating or heat pumps for creating that heat. One example here that I would like to show is this one on the passenger transport electrification that we find. Coming from Norway with quite a lot of electric vehicles, this chart for passenger vehicles looks quite likely. But what we see here is quite a big revolution where in 2040, more or less all passenger vehicles in the Nordics, so that's the stock of vehicles, have been exchanged to electric vehicles. What we found that was a bit more surprising was that in this scenario, contrary to the earlier scenarios we've done, we also see this for trucks, so for long distance road transportation as well. So it's lagging behind by maybe 5 or 10 years, but we see that for long distance transportation, electrification has become a vital tool. So in the earlier scenarios we've had in 2016 and 13, that would have been biofuels or hydrogen. So that's one key technology for achieving these emission reductions. Moving forward to carbon capture and storage, we in the analysis find that the ambitious targets that the Nordic countries have, in addition to a industry sector that has quite a lot of hard to abate sectors, and also for a few of the countries, net positive emissions from the land use change and forestry sector means that to get to net zero, there has to be some form of carbon capture and negative emissions. And what we did was that we did a sensitivity. So what you see here is 2 results from, so the highest bars with the most carbon capture is from it's kind of the usual standard assumptions on costs. And then we also wanted to see, okay, so what if this gets a lot more expensive than expected? So in the lower bars here, we've increased the cost of storage by 10 times the usually expected levels. And what you see is that for some of the countries where the land use change and forestry sector are already negative, that means that the carbon captures are less because it doesn't, the other solutions for electrifying the industry gets cheaper. But for especially Denmark and Iceland that has net positive emissions from the land use sector, we still see a significant portion of carbon capture. And what this means is that we already in 2035 needs to have quite a lot of carbon capture in the Nordic countries. So at a level of of 20 million tons. And if I remember correctly, that's about 5 times the size of the currently planned lighthouse project in Norway. So it's a quite a large chunk. What we also find, and that was also a bit surprising, was that most of this comes from biogenic capture, so bioenergy carbon capture and storage, mainly from co-production in district heating. And as mentioned, that's mainly because some of the countries needs to have negative emissions to get their carbon budgets aligned. And then also a large chunk of that again is being used for fuel productions. And that is mainly for the most high value fuels like jet fuel that can be refined to a high level that's necessary for kind of getting out the jet fuel we have today. And that's the results I would like to have. I would like to say you can access the report online. You can order a free copy as well. And we also have an open access model, a statistics database, a technology catalog, and a web tool where you can play around with the sensitivities as well. So thank you.
Excellent, Kevin. Good timing as well. So now let's move on to how the International Energy Agency and their tracking clean energy progress consider their various technologies that are needed to enable these two scenarios in the Nordic energy scenario, and as well as the new energy outlook. So I'd like to introduce Daniel Wenzel, who is working at the International Energy Agency in the Tracking Sustainable Transitions Unit within the World Energy Outlook team at the IEA. So his team tracks how policy measures are actually moving the needle on clean energy transitions, covering a range of metrics from energy access, government spending, and energy employment. The floor is yours.
Perfect. Thank you so much. So today, this is great to build on the great work that you guys had here of looking at those pathways to net zero, really looking in the short term, where are we at on being on track for those, both from a technology cost perspective and a deployment perspective, as well as the policies required to get there. So brief framing to get us started. As we know, historically, CO2 emissions were on the rise. Come Paris Agreement timeframe, at that point, the EIA's projections for CO2 saw those continuing to rise to 2050. But action after the Paris Agreement and new policies in place and lots of progress on renewables in particular have our new outlook looking at if we kept the current policies and market forces in today, where would the world drift to? And right now we see that actually now that drifts to a 50% chance of being a 2.2 degree world under current policies. Now, leading up to Glasgow, we saw a lot of progress in terms of new commitments towards net zero. And it's a big if that these net zero commitments will be made. But if they are hit, our new projections are a 50% probability that by the end of the century we would limit global warming to about 1.8 degrees C. This is still a far way off from what would be needed to reach net zero by 2050 in the energy sector, which puts us on track to be able to hit 1.5 with not a huge amount of net negative emissions. So, in particular, we're seeing a very concerning near-term gap. I feel like my cutting in and out.
It's in and out. Can we have another?
Better now?
Yeah,
Perfect. So I'm going to continue. Perfect. So in particular, we're seeing a short-term gap that's quite concerning in 2030, about a 14 gigaton gap, considering both energy sector CO2 and energy sector methane emissions. Fortunately, we know that there are a lot of solutions available today to resolve those emissions gaps. And a lot of them, about 40% of them by our estimates, today are cost effective. When we break those down, many of those are in the power sector, particularly wind and solar. Oh, one back. There we are. But also methane abatement, energy efficiency, and EVs. Thank you. Is this better? Okay, perfect. And so the remaining 60% is often pushing these technologies further, as well as also funding new things like innovation, as well as behavior change to a small degree, as well as also material efficiency and reducing the amount of materials we use. So The IEA has been looking sort of based on these scenarios, and this is the first year that we've put out what we call our Tracking Clean Energy Progress Report, benchmarking these against what would be necessary to hit 1.5 and not just a Paris-compliant trajectory. And what we're finding is across 46 different technologies, we have only 2 that are really on track. And we try to really make this simple and usable for policymakers, so once you get online, you can really click into all these technologies and get a lot more details in terms of costs, installation, projections, et cetera. But at the highest level, if it's green, we say it's on track roughly to where it needs to be today for net zero. Yellow means more action is required, and red just means not on track. So 2 are on track, 18 needs more action, and the remaining of the 46 are just not on track at the moment. So let's jump into the good news first, which is electric vehicles and lighting. We saw about 40% increase in electric vehicle sales last year, and this was amidst a 16% drop in total vehicle sales last year. So the share of EVs is really jumping markedly with a lot of great policy support and a lot more consumer adoption. Additionally, we see in lighting, 50% of all lighting sales are now LED globally, with some geographies basically having 100%, with most other forms of lighting being prohibited. We have one sector as well that we're seeing is broadly close to being on track, but needs a lot more action. This is what we call our energy integration. This is grids, fuel infrastructure, et cetera, to be able to clean all of those energy sources. In particular, if we wanted to call on one in particular, energy storage had a banner year with 50% increase, but however, that would need to jump 35 times that level of installation to reach what would be needed in 2030 for net zero. Additionally, really important to that is making sure that energy storage, as well as demand response, find access to the right market revenues to really catalyze activity in that space. Additionally, we saw hydrogen and direct air capture and other forms of CCUS have a big boom this year with a lot of government recovery plans earmarking innovation funding for those segments. So some promising action there, but still a lot more needed. In particular, thinking about how do we bring these to market and how do we create the right market incentives for offtake of these new technologies. Now power, I'll go through the rest of these quickly. Power is a good news, bad news kind of story. We see wind and solar obviously having great progress, but more still needed to be on track for net zero. But coal fire phase out as well as nuclear power, both elongating lifetimes and installing more, are off what would be needed in net zero. And end use sectors, in particular, industry and heavy transport are seeing major gaps there. And one of the big things we think can move the needle there is requiring more offtake for emerging technology. So increasing the level of biofuel blending, hydrogen blending in certain networks, and driving the right amount of market incentives for companies to pilot some of these in industry and adopt some of these new technologies in transport. And then finally, in fuel supply, methane abatement, as we said, a huge chunk of this. And we're really hopeful about the announcements made at COP about 30% reduction. Although that needs to be much higher to 75% of energy-related methane reduction needs to happen by 2030 in order to get there. So a little bit of a bleak outlook, but we're seeing governments are starting to really kind of turn the corner on this and mobilize a lot more investment in this. So we're tracking all of the different government expenditures going on globally right now and saying how much of that is going to clean energy or related clean energy infrastructure. And what we're seeing is that there is about $470 billion dedicated between now and 2030 towards clean energy from governments. And that will likely increase the amount of clean energy investment to about $400 billion, increase it by $400 billion over the next 3 years. That's only about 40% of what would be necessary to jolt the world onto a new set of rails and head towards net zero. And finally, possibly the most concerning thing is when we're thinking about where this funding and this government funding is coming from, it's mostly coming from advanced economies. These economies have the fiscal wherewithal to be able to move a lot more and shift their economies, but it's leaving about 70% of the world behind. And what we're seeing is advanced economies are about 60%, 70% almost of where they need to be to move to a net zero trajectory. Emerging economies only at 20%. So really the role of international finance to catalyze more action in that space needs to be a priority both at this COP and going forward, and figuring out the right mechanisms to use the limited amount of international concessional finance to stimulate a huge amount of private investment in that space. So I'll leave that there and there's a lot more to check out, both on our tracking for clean energy progress and also our policy tracking and government spending tracking that are all online, freely available. So thank you so much for your time.
So you've been all very good at keeping a timetable, so that's excellent. We have 15 minutes. But I'd like to start off with a question to you, Daniel, on the pledges that have been made here. How far do they, overall, how much do they help us in reaching the targets?
So before, when the World Energy Outlook came out in early October, we said that those current pledges were around 2.1, 2.2, and this is a 50% chance by the end of the century. So just to clarify some differences in those numbers there between BNEF and us, we're using sort of different things where they're looking at the very low and we're looking at the 50% probability there. So that was about 2.2 beforehand. The additional commitments, particularly some of the near-term stuff, including methane, gets us to about 1.8 as our current estimates on that. Again, 50% chance by the end of the century. So that's really promising, but the big gap is in the near term. We're seeing a lot of these long-term commitments moving the needle, and also there's a big if that those are going to be able to get to net zero in the timetables stated, because we're not making the investments and the down payments today on the innovative technologies we'll need to be able to get to net zero at the end of the middle of the century.
Right, thank you. A question to the two scenarios, so to speak. Does the technologies that he described and the maturity, does it match up to your models?
In a way, yeah, and I think maybe just to build a little bit on what Daniel said, I think your presentation made a really important point, which is the pledges are moving in the right direction, whether it's 1.8 or 2. I think there's some debate there. Kind of doesn't matter. It's going in the right direction. But then you showed the chart of all the red dots saying there's all these areas where we need more work. And guess what? We've only got 10 years to get it all. Those all need to be green in 10 years' time. So I think for me, one of my takeaways is at the end of this week when COP is over and the ministers come out and say we've achieved X, Y, and Z, I think we need to fixate a bit less on exactly what is X, Y, Z and think much more about what do we all need to go back to work next week, what do we actually need to do, and it is like deploy all those technologies.
So Kevin, in the rich north, how does it look like?
I think we are seeing quite a lot of good pushes on the technology development side. So we have a lot of work going on to decarbonize the maritime sector and the industries, and luckily for the Nordic countries, the power sector is more or less decarbonized already for most of the countries. But what we find in these scenarios is that a consequence of these new technologies that we find and develop and would like to have deployed is that the need for clean electricity is going up as well. And what we see, and as you've shown, is that on a global level and also in the Nordics, there's we got the tools we need to produce that electricity, mostly wind and photovoltaic solar. But what we see in the Nordics is that the build-out is also gaining a lot of, that's getting a lot of public acceptance issues on whether or not this is necessary and if it's been done at the right sites, etc. So even though that these technologies are there and they're cost efficient, it's also there are some troubles in getting them actually deployed at the scale that's needed to see these results in reality.
Thank you, Kevin. One thing that I noticed on your presentation was basically that you had this ceiling and floor where you could get behavioral changes. And we're talking about commitments and we're talking about public support for various measures. Do you account for that in your outlook and in your scenario as well?
I can go first. I think so. Yes, at BNEF we definitely see behavioral change being a big part of the solution, and we definitely see it in terms of the adoption curves you see on certain technologies, which we've already seen those adoption curves taking off in things like rooftop solar, in things like electric vehicles. And I think we need to understand a bit better what are the factors that drive those tipping points where you get mass adoption of new technologies and behaviors, be it plant-based protein or alternatives to flying and things like that. Because it's got to be a huge part of the solution.
Right.
Yeah, and so I think this is an important thing. There's sort of two types of behavior change that are important. One is getting people to buy the pieces of equipment needed. EVs, heat pumps. And the second piece is them actually using energy differently, flying less, doing virtual conferencing, not commuting. In our net zero scenario, we assume about 4% of total emissions reductions between now and 2050 of the cumulative would come from behavior change. And this is really important because we need to have some of that, but really saying how does this ubiquitously spread across all geographies, and in particular thinking about, I think a really good example is flying less from a certain perspective, especially in Europe where travel by rail is so easy. When someone's saying, oh, you can't do that for small island developing nations, particularly those that are dependent on tourism, this can be sort of a very difficult sticking point in how you push that forward, that their economies are predicated on people visiting there. So we tried to take not the most egregious assumptions on that and make sure it's modest and really relying on transferring otherwhere, but behavior change is essential, and we will not get there without that, particularly the portion of consumers adopting these new technologies and accepting them.
Thank you. So I'd like to open up for questions. Any questions? There you go. Oh.
Hi. Leonardo Pauli from the International Energy Agency. Is it on? Yeah? Okay. Leonardo Pauli from the International Energy Agency. I have a question for Albert. I understand why you had these 3 different scenarios as a useful analytical tool, but if you had to choose between one of the 3, where would you head towards?
Thank you for the question. I thought somebody might ask that. I think we are going to do more in terms of country-level scenarios. So actually, one of the reasons why we wanted to map out very different futures in this report is because it's very clear to us that different countries will choose different solutions and different mixes. And we've seen that actually in the work that Kevin showed, that actually is going to be different by different scenarios. So actually, in the coming year, we're going to start translating that into country-level scenarios where it won't be green, grey, red, because actually for some countries, red won't be relevant or grey won't be relevant. So we're going to do more work to understand how that all fits together. So that's kind of on the roadmap. I'm not going to tell you my favorite right now, but let's come back next year. Yeah, exactly.
Yeah, go ahead,
Kevin,
please.
I have a quick question for you.
Closer.
Sorry. A quick question for you, Kevin. I'm wondering if your analysis looked at the availability of battery minerals in terms of your approach. I'm just wondering whether or not we've got enough for electrification up to 2050.
That's good. For batteries.
Oh, that was for me? Sorry. I thought it was for Kevin. Critical minerals. We do a lot of work on critical minerals, and what we've found, particularly for batteries, is when we've looked at the key ingredients, lithium, cobalt, nickel, etc. What we typically find is that to get to net zero, particularly in road transport, where most of the battery demand is, there are enough mineral reserves in the world, but really only if we get good at recycling. And so that's really critical, because what you're going to find, not today, not tomorrow, but over the next 5-10 years, is we're going to have batteries coming to the end of life. We're going to have batteries. Is that working? No.
They can hear, we just can't hear.
Yeah? How's it? Okay.
Yeah.
So we will have more and more batteries coming to the end of life over the next 5 to 10 years. So we need to scale up the recycling infrastructure now so that we can be ready to recover all those minerals, because if we don't do that, then we're going to have a big problem going out to 2050.
Thank you.
Yeah, it's okay.
So,
yeah, just a bit of a simple one. So Richard Randall.
can't hear anything.
Hello. How's that?
I think the
Is that okay?
Who's it to?
More.
All of you.
okay.
Oh, especially
more
you
headphones.
at the end. Can you hear me okay?
We
Now
need
we're
more
in.
headphones.
Yeah. So in the slide with the red dots and the green dots, one of the things I noticed was that the 2 green dots were consumer-based. There were a lot of comments at the end about consumers having to adopt this and consumers having to change that. But a lot of the red dots were very industry-based. So I was just wondering if there are any comments on why you think that might be. I mean, obviously it's simple to change light bulbs, that's an easy one. But I'm just wondering if you have any comments on why you think that those are green and some of the other ones are red, and what needs to happen to get the industry-based to be like the consumer-based ones.
I can start with two pieces. One is, I think, just the cost declines on those, and also some of the restrictions in terms of minimum energy performance standards and in lighting. Like LEDs were sort of a no-brainer. That's very easy to regulate those into much higher prominence. But also I think that there's a lot of attention on how to get consumers to adopt these. And there's a lot of people, I think, who have a lot of emotional investment in that. So lots of people early on in the LEDs were like, it's really harsh light. And a lot of designers came in and said, okay, we really need to find these to be much more aesthetic. And same with EVs. I think it's there's a fashionable drive as well to saying, oh, I drive an EV. And so I think these are sort of moving it, but obviously predicated on these big cost declines as well. So they say something about you in addition to that. Where it becomes really tricky, I think, in industry and shipping is if you don't actually have those markets and the pricing schemes adjust, when they're thinking about their end consumer, they're not, your construction firm isn't buying a bunch of steel and cement saying, oh, does this say something about me? They're looking at bottom dollar there. And so those industries being so cost sensitive, unless you're actually able to put the right carbon pricing, other market signals in place, they're going to become a lot harder to move. So I think that's a really key piece, as well as also many of those have a lot more emphasis on emerging technologies that aren't ready yet today. And so oftentimes some of these reds here are both, we're not deploying enough, but also there's not enough in R&D spending to really get the pilot projects in place and the commercial scale-up needed to be on track.
Thank you. One more question.
One last question. Can you hear me? Can you hear me? So maybe it's a hard question as the last one, but I have to say I was very surprised when I saw the headline about the 1.8 degrees. Because it's very hard for people to orient themselves and to understand if we're actually making progress. And I really don't understand the math or the science behind it. I would be interested in understanding more. Because we know that by 2030 we have to have emissions, and there's another analysis going around by ETC that shows that we are 40% there on CO2 and also on CH4. And that would lead to 1.5 potentially. So I wonder how we can be at 1.8 with the pledges that actually are only 40% there. And what is the level of confidence of the analysis to make the headline out there?
Tricky questions. Yeah. Anyone want to go first?
I think this one's squarely directed at us. So. So one of that, I think it's obviously, even just in between our presentations, where we're at in terms of the degree of certainty. So we're relying on the IPCC scenarios, and in particular, we're looking narrowly at the energy sector on this. And so we're assuming sort of a median baseline for other things like LULUCF and other sectors on that. So we're assuming that right there. And then also in our net zero particularly, we are on the low end, for instance, of some of the more tricky content. So CCUS, we're quite low in terms of the total reliance on that. Net negative emissions, quite low in terms of one of the bottom scenarios of IPCC core scenarios there. And bioenergy, keeping it well below 100 exajoules, and really on the low end there for IPCC scenarios. So we feel pretty confident that it is on track. But again, this 50% versus a 10% confidence variable, I think is one of the big things there. The last thing I would highlight is this 1.8 assumes that the country's 80% of global emissions are covered by some form of net zero pledge at this point, or roughly around there with the new update. And so that is relying on those all being realized in full and on the right timescales. And that is a really, really big if. I think that out to 2030, we're already seeing this huge divide. And a lot of people are sort of punting it down the road saying, we'll figure it out down the road. And so for us, our STEP scenario, which gets us to 2.2, that is really our current assessment of saying the policy is in action today, this is where it's going to land us. So yes, it's good to say we're planting the flag, we're all going to get there, but really now we need to focus and say, what are we doing in terms of policies on the ground? Because the implementation gap is now growing much more than the ambition gap. So it's good to be able to say the ambition gap is shrinking and we're all aligned on this, but that implementation gap is what keeps me up at night. So.
Thank you. So, Albert, does this 1.8 and rings true to your outlook as well?
Thank you. To be honest with you, if the IEA says, I believe, I trust the analysis. I think it's good. But I agree with Daniel. It's all about what do we actually go away and do after the end of COP, because that is a huge gap in between where we're headed and where we now say we got to head. So I think that is absolutely coming into COP. I felt that if we could come away with pledges getting at 2 degrees or even better than 2 degrees, for me personally, I felt that was going to be a great outcome. It sounds like we may already be there 1 week in. If that's the case, I would much rather spend the next week talking about actually how do we get, like, what do we actually do to get there and deliver on those pledges.
Thanks. So, Kevin, the Nordic countries have carbon neutrality as a goal. Does the scenario show that we have any chance of hitting that target?
I think the scenario shows that it's possible, but as for the world, you also need to do the work to get there. So what we are trying to show is that there are at least three ways to get there. The way we're actually going to get there is probably some combination of these three scenarios. So what we try to do is to highlight the different pathways the politicians can take and the societies can choose from, and kind of show what are the benefits and the problems with each different scenario, and what kind of role would the Nordics like to take, both internally in the Nordics, but also at the European level as well, and what that means for the energy system in the Nordics, and for what that would mean of an energy structure that you would need, infrastructure that you would need to build out to get there.
Right.
Can I say one more thing?
Yeah.
Just to give an idea of what it is to get on track by 2030. In our analysis, we need to be building 5 times more wind power every year than we are now, 3 times more solar power than we are now every year to 2030. We need to put 300 million electric vehicles on the road, which today we have about 13 million. We need to put another 300 million on the road in the next 10 years. We have to install 200 million heat pumps in the next 10 years. So there's a lot of work to do, and looking forward to hopefully working with you all to get that done.
So thank you, Albert, for those uplifting numbers. So just go out there and buy cars and heat pumps and solar panels and everything. Thank you very much all for joining us and presenting your excellent thoughts and analysis. And at that moment we close the session because there's another event coming up. All the presentations will be available on the nordicenergy.org homepage. Also the scenarios and those things that are readily available will be there, including a recording of this session. So thank you very much for your attention, and enjoy COP.